the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza, and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. So they just were they were everywhere. And they destroyed everything. Verse 6, Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. Finally. And this repeats the cycle. They cry out, they get helped, and in this case, God's delaying the help a little bit. He's not immediately sending them a judge. He sends them a prophet first so he can tell them, this is what you're doing wrong. And prophets, of course, always were, I don't want to say doom and gloom, they were just honest. They told the Israelites, here's what you're doing wrong, here's how God wants you to fix it. So, they sent them a prophet. We don't know who the prophet was, but we just don't know. So the prophet said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. And he repeats the history to them because these people don't know, because their parents didn't tell them. Remember Deuteronomy chapter 6, where God said, here's what you have to do. Tell your children the stories so they will know. They didn't do that.
Sort of like now.
Sort of like now, exactly. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me. Very clear. So then the prophet goes away. We don't see all these steps, but the prophet goes away, and then the angel of the Lord comes to deliver a further message. Now, we need to watch this section closely because it varies between the angel of the Lord talking and God talking to Gideon. For a good explanation of why this might have happened, we have a supplement called The Angel of the Lord. It explains who the angel of the Lord is, when it appears, and why it was popping in and out in this section here. So the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. So we just heard previously that the Midianites were taking everything from the Israelites. Now, when you thresh wheat, you do it outside, so that the wind catches the chaff and blows it away, and the wheat falls down. Well, here, Gideon's in a wine press, which is inside, sometimes in a basement. He's doing that because he wants to hide the wheat from the Midianites. Now, this would kind of increase his workload by about 3 times, because he not only has to get the chaff off the wheat, then he's got to go and separate it by hand and then sweep away the chaff. So he's not doing himself any favors, but at least he gets to keep the wheat from the Midianites. Verse 12, when the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, we don't really know what Gideon looked like, but we're told from other sources, usually rabbinic history, that Gideon was not a big guy. And he kind of gives us an idea later on. But here, God isn't telling Gideon that he's a mighty warrior now, but he will be a mighty warrior in the future, because God will make him a mighty warrior. So here we get to the first of Gideon's excuses. Pardon me, my Lord, and we know he's speaking to the angel because it's lowercase. But if the Lord is with us, and Lord is all uppercase, so if God is with us, why has all this happened to us? Well, Gideon obviously doesn't know the history of his country. They get punished when they're disobedient. So he's trying to push the blame off on God. How come God's not with us? He said he'd be with us. Well, you sinned, and God goes away from you when you sin. Gideon goes on. Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian, because they sinned. Time to grow up, Gideon. Now, all of a sudden the angel disappears and God comes. in verse 14. And we know that because Lord is all capitalized. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" So here God's saying, look, don't worry how weak you are, how small you are. Go and with what you have, with what I gave you, and you're going to win because I am sending you. God's telling him flat out, don't worry about it. You can't beat these people anyway. I'm going to beat them for you. Now, we know that God is talking to them because in Hebrew, they have different words that mean Lord, but one word that means Lord means God, and one word that means Lord means leader, like a king or a knight. So we know when God is being spoken about or when an angel is being spoken of. So another one of Gideon's excuses in verse 15. "Pardon me, Lord. Pardon me, my Lord." So he's talking to the angel now. "But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." So Gideon's telling us he's just a small person. But we know that God always chooses unqualified people for his work, and he qualifies them for the work. We're going to hear that in this week's sermon too. Then God answered in verse 16, "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." So here God's telling them, don't worry about it. Just go, do what I'm telling you, because I'm going to take care of it. Gideon replied, another excuse, "If now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away till I come back and bring my offering." And God says, "I will wait for your return." So he's gonna test God. And the angel of God tells him, okay, here's what you need to give as a sacrifice to God in verse 20. The angel of God said to him, "Take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth." And Gideon did so. Then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and unleavened bread with the tip of his staff that was in his hand. Fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. So Gideon didn't even have to bring wood for the sacrifice. The angel provided the fire for him. And the angel of the Lord disappeared. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But the Lord said to him, "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." Now, here, we know that whenever people saw the face of God, they would die. God told Moses, "Don't look at me, I'm going to stick you in this rock." And Moses never really saw the face of God. But Gideon thought it even applied to God's angels. But God said in this case, don't worry about it. You didn't see me, you're not going to die. So Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it "The Lord is Peace." And it still sits there to this day. Verse 25. The same night the Lord said to him, "Take the second bull from your father's herd, the 7-year-old. Now some translations have, "Take a full-grown, mature bull from your father's herd," but God instructs which bull to take. So he's very specific. "Tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole." Now here, God is giving Gideon his first challenge, because whenever they destroyed the pagan idols, they would be killed. So here he's going to do it anyway, because he's finally starting to believe God. Verse 26, once the altar, the pagan altar, is torn down and the Asherah pole is torn down, then build a proper kind of altar. Now, we know a proper kind of altar is built with layers of uncut stone. We know that from Exodus. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 25, God told Moses, "If you make an altar of stones for me, do not build it with dressed stones, for you will defile it if you use a tool on it." Now, God didn't want them to use tools to make an altar because he wanted the stone to be just as he created it. And if they messed with it with a tool, a chisel, or a hammer, then they would have had a hand in making the altar. But God says, no, leave the rock just as I made it. It's good enough. And after you cut down the pole, use the Asherah pole that you cut down and offer the second bull as a burnt offering. Now God wanted a bull to tear down the altar to Baal, because the bull was a sign of Baal. That was one of the symbols they used. So God is being very symbolic here.
And the Asherah pole, that is also a god?
Yeah, remember Asherah, and I think Asherite? She was the wife of Baal. So they're both gods.
Okay.
They're both Canaanite gods. She's just a female. So Gideon took 10 of his servants, did as the Lord told him, and he did it at night because he wasn't that courageous yet, but still he did it. So that's good. So he did it, and of course the crowd goes crazy, and they want to kill Gideon. Verse 31, but Joash, Gideon's father, replied to the hostile crowd around him, are you going to plead Baal's cause? Are you trying to save God? So Gideon's father is saying, what are you trying to save a God for? If Baal is really a god, he can defend himself. So Gideon's father, Joash, is kind of getting the idea that, wait a minute, if my weak little son was able to tear down the altar and the Asherah pole, maybe these two things weren't gods after all, because my son can't do anything. That's what I'm guessing. So they let him slide, and because Gideon broke down Baal's altar, they gave him the name Jerubbaal, which means let Baal take care of him. So we're going to see these two names for Gideon come in and out for the next couple chapters. Now it's not as obvious as when the Bible changed between Jacob and Israel. Remember, the Bible used the name Jacob when Jacob was doing something wrong, and they used the name Israel for him when he was doing something right. But here it's not that clear, but we'll see it pop back and forth. Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. So Gideon is starting to get some courage. He showed a little bit of courage so far, but now we're going to see a different type of Gideon because the Spirit of God is on him. He sent messengers through Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. And these are the same tribes that helped Deborah. Asher didn't. But Manasseh, Zebulun, and Naphtali did. Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, not by yourself, as you have promised, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. So Gideon, he's got a little bit of courage, but he's still testing God. Look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand. So he's testing God. Shouldn't do that. Then Gideon said to God, don't be angry with me. And after God did this test, Gideon says in verse 39, let me just come up with one more test. Don't be mad at me. But this time, keep the fleece dry and let the rest of the ground be covered with the dew. That night God did so to prove it to Gideon. Only the fleece was dry, all the ground was covered with dew. Finally, Gideon has all his proof. No more tests. He's ready to go into battle in chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon. So we're kind of getting the idea that when we see the name Jerubbaal, he's got a little bit more courage. And all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, so at this time, I think Gideon had 15,000 men, I think.
Now, where did he get them all?
Well, from all the tribes.
Oh.
If we look above, he called Manasseh.
Oh, arms. Okay.
Yeah, in verse 35.
Okay.
So he's got, I think, 15,000. I might be wrong. Anyway, he's got a whole bunch of men. But God says, no. You got too many people, because if you take this many people into battle, they're going to think that they won. And they would say, my own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave. Now this is the same test that they used in Deuteronomy chapter 20. In Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 8, Moses said, then the officer shall add, is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened. So that's the first test. If they're scared, go home. But the Lord said to Gideon, so 22,000 men left, with 10,000 remained. Okay, so they started out with 32,000 men. So that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
But the Lord said to Gideon, that's still too many men. 10,000, too many. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say this one shall not go, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongue as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of the men drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down to their knees to drink. So God told Gideon, okay, take 300 men. And that's all you get. So Gideon, in verse 8, sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300. The thing we don't know until Judges chapter 8 is that the Midianites that they're going to fight have 135,000 men. So even with his initial force of 32,000 men, they would have been over 100,000 short. Now God gives Gideon only 300 men to go up against 135,000. Because God wants to prove to Gideon and all the Israelites, you don't win battles without me. And you're not going to win this one without me. So, changes the story in everybody's eyes. They took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down to the camp, because I am going to give it to your hands. God's guaranteeing them victory. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they're saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So God's got this all planned. He knows that Gideon, even with the Holy Spirit, doesn't have a lot of courage, so he's going to make sure that Gideon gets enough courage. He says, go listen to what they're talking about. So he and Purah and his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. In verse 12, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern people had settled in the valley thick as locusts, 135,000 of them. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. Perfect timing, God's timing. So the Midianite says, I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded in verse 14, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Now, obviously, God gave him the interpretation of the dream, because how would he get the sword of Gideon from a round loaf of barley bread rolling into the tent? Obviously, God told him a story. Now, the loaf of barley bread is kind of significant because barley was the cheapest grain, and that's probably all the Israelites had left. Verse 15, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. So now he finally understands that God's going to let him have a victory. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into our hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Notice, no weapons. They had no weapons. All they had was jars and trumpets. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do it exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" Anybody see a problem with that last statement? For the Lord and for Gideon?
He was taking credit.
He was taking credit. This is Gideon, with all Gideon's faults of being cowardly and small and afraid and testing God, this is probably the worst because he's taking credit for God's work. This is the first big problem we see in Gideon. Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 other companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, and grabbing the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon," repeating the problem. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. So what happened is the Midianites were so confused by all this noise and crashing and breaking jars, they started attacking each other. So God made them attack each other to reduce the numbers further.
Is that friendly fire?
That's friendly fire. Exactly. Exactly. Good. Perfect analogy, Gene. Friendly fire. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The Lord caused them. Because Gideon and his troops have no swords, they have no weapons at all, only God could do this. The army, the Midianite army, fled to Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. Once again, God gave an oversized army to the smaller Israelite force and let them win. Now, this